Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing my season preview of the 24-25 NHL season for the San Jose Sharks. Now, I actually went back and watched my season preview from last year of the 23-24 season, and in that I talked about the fresh new faces that the Sharks were adding to the roster, like Duclair and Granlund, and I talked about a few of the young players who would be making their full-time NHL debuts, like Henry Thrun and William Eklund, and I made the statement that that season was going to be fun to watch for us San Jose Sharks fans. And I must say now, a year later, that I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire life. This past season for the Sharks was the opposite of fun. In fact, it was even depressing at times to watch the Sharks go through the motions over a full 82-game regular season. So this time around, I have learned from my mistakes. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And so I will not make any sort of outlandish claims that this is going to end up being a super exciting season to watch for us San Jose Sharks fans, but it shouldn't be too controversial and it should be somewhat safe to be able to say that it will be an improvement watch experience wise over what we had seen last year. The Sharks are adding yet another fresh group of faces like Toffoli and Wenberg, but primarily the big spotlight is on the NHL debut of Macklin Celebrini and the NHL debut of Will Smith. So there should at the very least be a little bit of fun within this team. However, when it comes to actual performance, how much of an improvement are we expecting from last year? The Sharks were downright horrible. They had the worst NHL full 82-game regular season of the salary cap era. That's how bad they were. A record of 19-54-9 for just 47 points, which of course was dead last in the standings, though that did of course help them win the draft lottery and allow them to pick up Macklin Celebrini. So it was not all for nothing that the Sharks had to struggle through that. However, this year it seems as though Mike Grier and the San Jose Sharks are looking for a little bit of improvement in the standings. It's just based on how much they're actually going to go up and how much of an impact is it actually going to have even if they put up a few more wins. Because it must be said, if the Sharks add, let's say, 10 more wins compared to last year, they end up with something like 29-44-9. That would put them at 67 points, which would have been good still for fourth last in the league. That actually put it even more so into perspective how poor the Sharks were this past season. If the Sharks were to actually double their point totals, so they were to get double the amount of victories from 19 to 38, that would put them at 94 points, which last year would have still had them miss the playoffs. So even though with the Sharks they have had significant upgrades to their forward group with these young talents inserted, with these free agents signed, it is expected still that the Sharks will finish bottom 5 in the league, and many, just like last year, are predicting perhaps a last place finish in general. Would that be the end of the world for the San Jose Sharks? Not necessarily. I just mentioned how it was able to nab them the first overall pick, and as such able to pick up Macklin Celebrini. Something like that could once again happen here in 2025 if this were to have the same result, but at the very least, if the Sharks do still finish last, we are hopeful that it can at least be more tolerable to actually witness it happen, because as we know, last season for the Sharks, they were not just bad in the standings, but it was just a terrible viewing experience to have to go through. It felt as though 75% of the games, which is pretty much the amount of losses that they had, it wasn't even particularly close, and the Sharks barely even looked like an NHL team at times. There is some hope that that can turn around a bit this season. That sure, the Sharks will be losing more games than they're going to win, perhaps by a pretty decent margin, but that can actually look like a team that belongs in the NHL. Now let's move on to what we expect from the roster. Today was pretty much confirmation day, as it was the deadline to announce the opening night roster, and there was some potential drama, of course, because of the fact that the Sharks did not actually put anybody on waivers yesterday. There were question marks of if particularly Danil Gushin will actually have made it to the opening night roster. Well, the Sharks have decided to take an approach that is rarely seen, which of the 23-man roster, 15 of them are actually forwards. So the Sharks currently are not actually carrying a 7th defenseman. It's not the end of the world because, of course, you only need 6 defensemen to actually play, But like I said, you don't usually see this, but Danil Gushchin has made a good enough case for him, of course, to get himself into the starting lineup. So let us talk about the lines that I have. These are slightly different to what Ryan Warsofsky is currently running in practice for the San Jose Sharks. Not to say that this is where I expect them to end up, but this would be sort of my dream lineup, I guess, while also taking into account the ideas that Warsofsky actually has for this team. So let us start off with the top line of Eklund, Celebrini, and Toffoli. This was something that even back a couple of months ago in July, when I made my video about the early lineup predictions that I had for this team, I had these three players together because it just seems like the type of line that can really work exceptionally well. You have Tyler Toffoli, who is that veteran presence. This player has won a Stanley Cup in his career with the Los Angeles Kings. He knows what it takes to win, and he's also a very efficient scorer. He knows how to put the puck in the net. And then when you place him with players like Celebrini, and we'll talk about Eklund a bit here right now, Eklund has been sort of evolving his game to try and actually shoot more in certain situations, which I think is something that the coaching staff has really tried to drill into him. But he is also still a very skilled playmaker and can really help complement Toffoli and really set him up for those goal-scoring chances. And then when it comes to Celebrini as the wild card here in this lineup, he has been spectacular in the essentially 1.5 preseason games that he has gotten. Coming into the regular season, it is obviously a significant step up, and so it still remains a question mark of just how well he will actually be able to do when all the lights are on him in real meaningful NHL hockey games. But he seems to have a real knack for the net. He's got a great shot. He plays with an immense amount of speed. He's got great playmaking ability. He's just an incredibly well-rounded player, which is exactly as advertised. That is exactly what the scouting reports said about him. And so really, he could fit onto any line and be the absolute perfect fit, because whatever you need from him, you're going to be able to get, because he has every single possible tool in his toolbox. It's going to be so fantastic to watch him develop over just this first full rookie season, and of course, the future in his career. Then we get to the second line, where we have that duo of Will Smith and Zetterlund. This has been together for the majority, if not the entirety, of this preseason, and they're going to be joined by Mikael Granlund. No surprise, of course, Granlund was perhaps the Sharks' best forward from last season. He certainly led the team in terms of points, and so it was obvious that he would end up getting the top 6 slot. It's just that through the preseason, he was injured for a decent chunk of that time. What is interesting is Warsofsky is actually wanting to give Will Smith, at least on paper, the center position of this second line. I had originally thought a couple of months ago that Will Smith would actually be, if in the top 6, trialed on the wing, and Granlund would end up being that center spot, simply because Granlund was relied on so heavily by David Quinn last season for the defensive roles, and usually it is the center who actually gets that. So it is possible that even if on paper Will Smith is said to be the center, that Granlund will end up taking a decent chunk of the faceoffs on the ice for this line, and he may even end up getting the stronger defensive roles in those situations. We shall see, but I think that this is also a line that can work very, very well. Granlund is a strong mentor type of player, like I mentioned with Tyler Toffoli. While Granlund doesn't have a Stanley Cup in his back pocket, he has been in the NHL for a pretty long time at this point, and he has had success in the past with the teams that he has been on. We saw him be that strong guiding light for some of the Sharks' younger players, like Zetterlund in particular, but also like William Eklund last year. So I think he can do that again for Will Smith. He's more of a pure playmaker, of course, Mikael Granlund is, but while Will Smith also has that kind of more leaning towards the playmaking ability, there is some potential for him to be a bit of a scorer. And then of course the third player on this line, Fabian Zetterlund, is pretty much a pure scorer. He'll take a shot from literally any sort of position at all. We saw that in the preseason. While he missed the net a lot of the times, maybe with Granlund setting him up a bit better, and with that extra chemistry that we know they have from last season, it can gel a bit more. We shall see exactly if Will Smith is even able to hold on to a second line spot, simply because of the fact that in the preseason, he wasn't all that great. He had some struggles, and now with the massive jump up in terms of performance necessary to have here to belong in the regular season, it's not going to be getting any easier for Smith, but trial by fire here. We shall see if he can thrive. Then we get to the third line. This is where we actually have a bit of a departure from what Ryan Warsofsky is currently running in the practices. So he has Wenberg, Cunnin with Barclay Goodrow, and then Gushin on the fourth line. But that to me is an inexplicable choice. I understand wanting to have Gushin here on the third line and not giving him immediately the second line spot. Personally, maybe I would have leaned towards a Granlund, Zetterlund, Gushin third line and then have Smith on the third, but whatever. If you think Smith is necessary to surround him with that really strong talent and that Gushin can thrive on the third line like we have seen through this preseason, I definitely understand that approach, but having him on the fourth line like they currently do, that seems like a very, very weird choice. If he ends up with just like 10 to 11 minutes per night, how are we really going to expect him to actually thrive in the NHL? So to me, I think he's more so in line for like a 14 to 15 minutes type of guy with some strong power play sort of deployments, and then actually still have him in a decently successful spot here on the third line, because at the very least he can end up playing with someone like Wenberg, who isn't necessarily a offensive dynamo. He's not some incredible juggernaut type of player who's really going to drive this third line forward, but at the very least he has more offensive talent than anyone who the Sharks will probably have on their fourth line this year, and so that could end up being a decent complement with Gushin, who we have seen more of the sort of playmaking from this preseason, with I think the 9 of his 10 points being assists. But we also know that even from his few games that he's had in the NHL, that he's also got a really good shot that he is able to make use of. So if he's getting set up by someone like Wenberg, who is pretty much a pure playmaker, like a Joe Thornton-esque type of player, that could have some success. And then the third player on this line, I was deciding, I wasn't sure if the Sharks maybe should go with someone like Dellandrea, but I ended up deciding on Luke Cunnin. Cunnin impressed me through this preseason, and going for a bit more of a physical forechecking force on this third line to go with Gushin and Wenberg, I think would do them some good. And then when it comes to the fourth line, I have pretty much the last three players here. Not a ton to say. These are just kind of like the two wingers who impressed me the most out of the rest of them in this in the preseason, and then Nico Sturm as their fourth line center. This would be a pure defensive fourth line. Sturm has like a bit of offense of his game, and maybe we'll see something from Ty Dellandrea, but besides that, it's pretty much just a stock standard fourth line in the NHL. Then we get to the sort of forwards on the outside looking in, and of course the first one is Carl Grundstrom. It seemed as though once the Sharks picked him up in that trade for Kyle Burrows this past offseason that he would get a chance to be tried out here in the top 12, but he lost his spot pretty fair and square to Danil Gushin, who put up those 10 points, and Grundstrom, the weakest, like I said, of those four fourth liners there, Cunnin, Goodrow, Dellandrea, and himself. So he's probably like 1 foot in the door still. I would imagine that the moment that Gushin falters, unfortunately, he'll likely come out of the lineup at some point, unless he's really, really continuing to do exceptionally well, and Grundstrom is likely the first man in. Then it comes to Klim Kostin, now currently as the 14th forward, but this doesn't necessarily exclude him from ever getting into the Sharks lineup, barring multiple injuries, because I do think if someone were to actually get injured that's in the top 6, the Sharks would want to bring in at least a small bit more of offensive prowess. For instance, let's say you're a couple games into the season and someone like Fabian Zetterlund ends up missing a few games due to injury. Moving Gushin up to a second line and then having Kostin step in for a bit more of an offensive flair on the third line is certainly a possibility. So while I think there's a much higher chance that Grundstrom is that next man in, Kostin shouldn't give up hope just yet. Then we get to Giovanni Smith, whose inclusion here on the main starting roster honestly drew a couple of question marks from me when I noticed that being the case, because the Sharks did not waive him yesterday. To me, while Smith was solid through this preseason, I take a look at what he did for the Sharks last year, where he was also solid in that preseason, but then he failed to even consistently make the roster on a team that ended up, like I said earlier, being the worst team in the salary cap era of the NHL pretty much. So the fact that he wasn't even good enough to make the team then makes me feel as though that with an improved forward group this year, he's very, very unlikely, but maybe there are going to be like some specific games that Warsofsky will want to have Giovanni Smith play in a sort of enforcer type of role, I guess. But the thing is that the Sharks can't really run with 15 forwards for the entirety of this season. It's fine for game one in the immediate short term, but somebody has to get sent down, and I feel as though the correct answer to that question is Givani Smith. He should be the one getting waived. It's unlikely that he were to actually get picked up in the first place, especially now. Maybe there was a chance yesterday, but even then, very, very low. Now, especially with rosters pretty much set in place, it would be a bit more of a surprise. But to me, Gushchin is the obvious choice, and Smith, he might get a couple of games at some point if multiple injuries do occur, or if there's like a pristine, perfect situation that Warsofsky foresees, but realistically, he shouldn't play all that much. And then when it comes to the other two forwards here that I do want to mention, the first is Thomas Bordeleau, who, you know, it's a really unfortunate situation because I was really impressed with Bordeleau near the end of last season. He played like 25 or so games on the year, really, really strong. To me, I thought Bordeleau would be in the exact position Gushchin currently finds himself in, but he's been injured the entirety of this training camp. He is apparently week to week, which means he's not just any day now going to be coming back, but we could be waiting until like November, perhaps even a bit later than that, before he's actually fully healthy enough to play. And at that point, unless the Sharks have made some trades or have some injuries, it's hard to foresee Bordeleau breaking in and actually getting on the team at some point, because without that training camp, without that preseason where there's a lot more open lineup spots, it's not very easy to work with. So it is likely that Bordeleau, once he's healthy, he'll head back down to the San Jose Barracuda, where he will unfortunately, again, to say that word for like the fourth time, have to prove himself once more with the Barracuda and show that he is worthy. Once we get to the latter parts of the season, you know, January, February, March, where the Sharks are indeed making some moves, making some trades, perhaps at the deadline if they move on from Granlund or Cunnin or CC, these type, well, CC is the defenseman, but you understand the idea. Once they move on from a few more players, spots will open up and Bordeleau could jump into one, but for now, we will have to wait. And then the final player to talk about is Logan Couture. Unlike with Bordeleau, Couture missing an entire training camp preseason would certainly not exclude him from a lineup spot. If technically Couture was healthy tomorrow, he would get into the lineup immediately. The problem is, of course, Couture will not be healthy tomorrow. In fact, there's a big question of whether or not Couture will be healthy again at any point to get another NHL game. He played 6 games last season, then went back out with the same injury, and apparently he pretty much hasn't skated at all thus far in this off-season. So he still seems to be very, very far, and while I do include him here because he is the captain, and like I said, he would get sort of an immediate spot in the lineup if he were to be healthy at some point, it seems more and more unlikely as the days pass that he will be ever returning. Then we get to the defensive side of things. The defensive pairings are a lot less interesting to talk about. I actually mentioned this last year with the Sharks defensive pairings, where they don't really have like a set structure and hierarchy to the 6 guys that they have, because honestly, the defensive pairings that were, or the defensive roster, I should say, from last year that was quite bad, has really not undergone that much of an upgrade. Wallman is a new player and will help out the Sharks, but otherwise, everything is more or less pretty much the same. So if we take a look at the top pairing, we have Wallman and CC. These are the 2 new faces here. CC replacing Ty Emberson from last year. The difference in those 2 players, obviously CC being that veteran guy, maybe slightly more reliable, but Emberson was actually quite good with the Sharks, so I'm not sure how much of a difference in terms of defensive play we are actually going to be expecting. It'll be interesting to see how much of a sort of leadership role these two players could actually take as the Sharks' number 1 defensive pairing, and how much they will actually be able to handle the really tough assignments that may very well be heading their way. When it comes to the second defensive pairing, we have Ferraro with Ruda. I had originally thought that Ruda would end up maintaining his spot with Thrun, which is something the Sharks ran a lot last season, but like I said, it doesn't matter a significant amount as long as you're getting that left wing, that left D, right D type of dichotomy here. It's pretty much exactly what you would expect. And so Ferraro, if on that second defensive pairing and actually manages to see a reduction in terms of ice time compared to last year, I do hope that that will actually end up benefiting him in the long run. And then the final defensive pairing of Thrun and Benning, pretty much the last 2. But what's really more interesting to talk about here from the defensive side is the players who are not going to be on that Game 1 starting roster. We start off with Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who seems to be in a similar situation, I think, to Thomas Bordeleau, maybe slightly less long-term, but is still injured and is still out for multiple games. So as a 7th defenseman, he is not going to be the reliable replacement that we may have originally thought, although reliable and Vlasic don't usually go in the same sentence anymore. It seems as though the Sharks will end up running with Mukhamadullin as a 7th defenseman. But again, another issue arises is that while Mukhamadullin is a lot more short-term, he was also injured for the entirety of the rookie face-off tournament, which he was supposed to be a participant in, as well as training camp and preseason. So how much of an impact he'll actually be able to have with the Sharks and the early parts of this season is entirely unknown, because he is an unknown quantity coming into this. We basically only have what he did last year as an example, which was pretty decent, but of course it would have been much nicer to see him over these last few weeks. And so that leaves one other player to talk about, and that one is Luca Cagnoni. Today he was sent back down to the Barracuda. Not a surprise to actually see that happen. He had a really successful preseason, significantly better than really what anybody was expecting from this player. But as I said, the Barracuda was definitely where he would be heading. However, with Vlasic injured for perhaps a couple more weeks at least, and Mukhamadullin still on sort of the mend here and having not gotten an entire preseason or training camp, if, let's say, an early injury were to occur within the first couple of games here, someone like Thrun were to head down with some sort of day-to-day point, would it be Cagnoni the first man up? There's honestly a decent chance that that is the case. So he might be able to make his NHL debut at some point this year. And then later down the line, when indeed those trades do come in, perhaps if CC does get moved, is Cagnoni a first man up at that point? Maybe a bit less, because of course it depends on Vlasic and Mukhamadullin, but Cagnoni, like I said, might be able to get a game. When it comes down to who will actually be the 7th defenseman in a more long-term situation, Vlasic or Mukhamadullin, I would suspect it would be Vlasic, simply because of the fact you don't want Mukhamadullin just sort of sitting on the sidelines here with the San Jose Sharks and not actually getting games. It would be much preferable to have him as the top pairing defenseman with the Barracuda than having him as a 7th guy. Obviously, if it came to actually playing in the lineup, I would take Mukhamadullin over Vlasic 10 times out of 10, but I'm not sure if there's really an opening for that. And then finally, we have the goaltenders for the Sharks. For the start of the season, we've got Vanacek and Blackwood. The Sharks have dealt with a lot of injuries through this preseason, and Askarov was not spared from that. He missed the entirety of the rookie face-off tournament, though he wasn't expected to be a participant at that, as well as training camp and preseason. So that perhaps small chance, or even medium-sized chance, that he'd be able to make it to the main San Jose Sharks roster for Game 1, perhaps even play on that first day, not going to happen now. He's with the San Jose Barracuda. He's with that training camp currently, and we shall see what type of progress is made for him. I expect at some point for this season he will make the jump up to the NHL, but whether that happens within the next couple of months or perhaps closer to January and February is anybody's guess. It depends on just how much success he's able to have in the minors. When it comes to the current duo that the Sharks actually have in the NHL of Vanacek and Blackwood, currently it seems as though that Vanacek has been the better goaltender through this preseason, and so it is very possible that he ends up getting the start, but at the same time we also know the Sharks have some familiarity with Mackenzie Blackwood. They know what he is capable of from having seen him the entirety of last season, and Warsofsky was the assistant coach last season, so he knows Blackwood at least more intimately than he knows Vanacek. As such, it is technically possible that they will lean more so towards Blackwood, but to me it seems as though Vanacek should be that guy, but in the end it doesn't really matter all that much. It's still going to end up being a 1A, 1B setup until something breaks and Askarov sort of gets that call up, and then maybe he will end up being the starter at that point. But that will do it for this season preview. Like I said, while I'm not predicting that the Sharks are going to be outstanding this year, they're going to likely be very, very far from that. A bottom 5 finish is very likely in the cards. A bottom 3 finish is certainly possible, and perhaps even finishing dead last could be there on the table. But hopefully, at the very least, we could have a little bit more fun here. Class dismissed.